In this video lecture, I'll be covering three subtopics in topic 3. So 3.6, biogeochemical cycling, specifically the carbon cycle and the nitrogen cycle. 3.7, abiotic factors influencing the distribution of species. And part of 3.8, biotic interactions. So we've already talked a bit about the carbon cycle, so I'm going to repeat some stuff here in this lecture. So we covered it last Friday. First thing about the carbon cycle is important because carbon is an element that makes up all organic molecules, a large portion of the organic molecules. It is found in organic matter, both living and dead. We find it in fossil fuels, and it's used to construct complex molecules in organisms like RNA and DNA. However, if we look at the Earth's crust and the rock material, we would find that carbon is not an abundant element in these materials. So here we have a diagram representing the carbon cycle, and we can see the major stores where carbon is found. Carbon is found as carbon dioxide gas in the atmosphere. It's found in the oceans. It's found in the lithosphere as coal, oil, gas, limestone, and dolomite. And there's a large store of carbon in the biosphere. We've modified the carbon cycle by converting some of the coal, oil, and gas into carbon dioxide gas by the burning of these fossil fuels. And then we've reduced the amount of carbon stored in the biosphere by converting natural vegetation into cropland and urban development. So let's review once again where carbon is found, these major sinks. It's found as organic molecules in living and dead organisms found in the biosphere. It's found as carbon dioxide gas in the atmosphere. There's a large store of organic matter in the soils, and much of that organic matter is composed of carbon. And carbon is found in the lithosphere as fossil fuels and sedimentary rock. Examples of sedimentary rock include limestone, dolomite, and chalk. And then finally, we have a large store of carbon in the oceans, either as dissolved atmospheric carbon dioxide, the gas, or it's already been, the carbon has been incorporated into the shells of marine organisms. These are calcium carbonate shells. So this table reviews how much carbon is found in 6 major sinks. So notice in the atmosphere, carbon has increased substantially because of our burning of fossil fuels and releasing from these fossil fuels carbon dioxide gas. Before industrialization, there's about 578 billion metric tons of carbon, and by 2022, this had increased to 872 billion metric tons. The largest carbon store, or the 2 largest carbon stores, are marine sediments and sedimentary rocks, and then the ocean. Fossil fuel deposits contain approximately 4,000 billion metric tons of carbon. So, as I said, in the ocean, sea life has the ability to fix biocarbonate with calcium to form calcium carbonate, and this is used to build shells and skeletons of these organisms. When these organisms die, their shells and the hard body parts, skeletons, don't decompose. They sink to the bottom of the ocean, where they accumulate as carbonate-rich deposits. Over time, these carbonate-rich deposits become sedimentary rocks. So ocean deposits are the second biggest sink of carbon on the planet. As I said, the lithosphere is the biggest. So how do ecosystems gain carbon? They gain it through photosynthesis. So carbon dioxide plus water and solar radiation produces in chloroplasts glucose and oxygen. Carbon dioxide enters the waters of the ocean by simple diffusion, so just diffusing into seawater from the atmosphere. The amount that can diffuse into the oceans is a function of temperature. With lower temperatures, more carbon dioxide moves from the atmosphere into the oceans. If Earth temperatures warm up, then there's a net transport of carbon dioxide from the oceans to the atmosphere. As I said before, dissolved carbon dioxide in seawater can remain as is, or it can be converted into carbonate or bicarbonate and then produce shells and skeletons of marine organisms. So carbon returns back to the atmosphere from plants and animals through the process of respiration. And of course, we know that respiration it involves the metabolism of the organism and helps the organism function. Respiration takes place in both plants and animals. So carbon-based organic molecules in respiration are in mitochondria are broken down into carbon dioxide gas and then water. Carbon is stored in the lithosphere in both inorganic and organic forms. So inorganic would be coal, oil, gas, limestone, and dolomite. Organic would be soil, organic matter in the top layers of soil. So as I mentioned, inorganic deposits of carbon, we're talking about coal, oil, natural gas, oil shale, and then sedimentary deposits like limestone and dolomite and chalk. Organic forms in the lithosphere include litter. So litter is the material that falls from trees, the needles, the branches, bodies of dead organisms. Then that is converted into organic matter, and then in the final stages of decomposition, you get a substance called humus. So humic substances, and these are very fine-grained materials, and then from that the humus is converted back into the elements, nutrient elements. Some carbon dioxide is released by volcanoes. Currently not much, but in the past there might have been large amounts of carbon dioxide being released by volcanoes, and it may have had a warming effect on the Earth's climate. How can this occur? It can occur when limestone or dolomite-rich rock is subducted, melted, and then is spewed out by a volcano. Okay, since the Industrial Revolution, humans have been aggressively modifying the amount of carbon dioxide found in the atmosphere and the oceans. Carbon dioxide is increased by over 50% during this time period, from about 275 parts per million to about 424 parts per million today. How high could it go? It all depends on how we quickly move from using fossil fuels for energy to renewable forms of energy. The range is somewhere about between 450 to 600 parts per million. Best estimate is probably about 525, 550 parts per million, and then it'll level off as we no longer emit carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. So fossil fuel combustion currently accounts for 65% of the carbon that we now find in the atmosphere. The other 35% is from deforestation and land cover change. So taking natural ecosystems and converting them into agricultural systems replaces a large amount of biomass by a small amount of biomass, and there's a net export of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. Okay, let's now look at the nitrogen cycle. The nitrogen cycle is also an important nutrient cycle in ecosystems, and it's a little bit more complicated than the carbon cycle. So if you were to examine organic matter, you'd see that it contains a large amount of nitrogen in the construction of the organic molecules. Some organic molecules that contain a lot of nitrogen include amino acids, proteins, and nucleic acids. On Earth, most of the nitrogen for ecosystems is stored in the atmosphere, and it's stored as nitrogen gas. N2 is the chemical formula. So this diagram represents the nitrogen cycle, and we can, as I said, the atmosphere is the major store. We are increasing the amount of nitrogen in the atmosphere through fossil fuel burning, primarily coal and oil. And we also add nitrogen to soil systems through fertilization in order to have our crops grow. So the amount of nitrogen stored in the atmosphere is about 1 million times larger than the total amount of nitrogen found in living organisms. Plants are the organisms that take up nitrogen from the soil and then pass it on to animals through consumption. Plants can take up only two types of nitrogen, two forms of nitrogen. Ammonium ion, and that's only a small group of plants, but most plants need nitrogen in the form of nitrate, so NO3 negative. As I said, animals receive their nitrogen by consuming plants or other animals that consume plants. So as I said, nitrogen is really important for the growth of plants. Here's an experiment that I did for my PhD thesis, trying to see if nitrogen was a limiting nutrient for tidal marsh plants. So you can see the plants around the stick are much larger than the ones surrounding it, and that's because I added nitrogen there, and that showed that these plants were limited by nitrogen. They would grow better if more nitrogen was available. So nitrogen is stored in both living and dead organic matter in ecosystems. Decomposers found in the upper soil layer chemically convert organic matter nitrogen into ammonia and then into ammonium salts. This process that's carried out by certain types of bacteria, actinomycetes and fungi, is called mineralization. And the form of nitrogen ammonium, that NH4 plus, so the charge of that compound is positive, and it can be held by clay particles, and clay cells have negative charges around their surface. So we've just talked about the center part of this diagram. See the cow? So it's releasing organic matter, and through mineralization, that's converted into ammonium. And that process then needs other processes to convert the nitrogen into nitrates, which is the form that can be used by plants. And we'll talk about that in a minute. This diagram represents the various forms of nitrogen in the soil. So you can see NH4, the ammonium, and then also the nitrite and the nitrates. Nitrate is NO3 minus. Notice it's got a negative charge. And nitrite, which is toxic to plants, is NO2 minus. Now, those having a negative charge, they cannot be held by clay micelles because they have the same charge as the outer surface of the clay micelle. But ammonium can, so NH4 plus can be held by clay micelle, and there can be some cation exchange for that form of nitrogen, the ammonium, to the plant. Although I said not all plants can use ammonium. So plants prefer the NO3 minus, and it's quite soluble, so it's easily lost because it's not held by the soils. Plants have to take it up rather quickly. So most of the ammonium is chemically altered by a type of bacteria that belongs to the genus Nitrosomus, and the ammonium is converted through chemical oxidation into nitrate. So that's one stage. Then you need the second stage to get the nitrogen in the nitrate form, which plants can use, and that is done by another group of bacteria in another genus called Nitrobacter. So Nitrobacter converts the nitrite into nitrate, and the nitrate is the preferable type of nitrogen that plants can consume. Both of the processes above involve chemical oxidation, and both are known as nitrification. Now, as I said, nitrate is not held by the clay micelles, so it's easily lost in the soil system by leaching, so water moving through the soil profile, and then it ends up in groundwater or in aquatic systems, streams and lakes. Now, nitrogen can also be lost by another set of bacteria that do something called denitrification. So this is a process where the nitrate is converted back into nitrogen gas or nitrous oxide gas, and it usually occurs in anaerobic environments, so water-sogged environments. So almost all of the nitrogen found in a terrestrial ecosystem originally came from the atmosphere. How does it first enter the ecosystems? It can enter by way of lightning. So lightning, the high temperatures of lightning can convert nitrogen gas into solid forms of nitrogen, and then it falls out in rain. Or, and this is most of the nitrogen in ecosystems, it can be biochemically fixed by specialized microorganisms like bacteria, actinomycetes, and cyanobacteria. And I talked about these bacteria before. They usually form symbiotic relationships with plants, and they exchange nitrogen for carbohydrates with the plants in nodules that are found in the root system. So how have human activities altered the nitrogen cycle? There's four general ways where we've altered the nitrogen cycle. One, we need, in order to grow our crops, we need additional nitrogen to feed the growing crops, and this comes by way of nitrogen fertilizers. Not all of this nitrogen is taken up by the plants. Some of it is denitrified back into the atmosphere. Also, some of the nitrogen, when it's in the form of nitrate, is lost by way of leaching into the groundwater. And then, as I said, it can go into aquatic systems after that. When we burn fossil fuels or trees, that combustive process releases nitrogen into the atmosphere as a gas. So it's the second way that nitrogen can enter. Third, we keep a lot of livestock. and cows, goats, sheep, livestock release large amounts of ammonia by way of their wastes. This ends up on the soil surface and then infiltrates in with rainwater and is added to the soils, where it can leach or could be used by the plants, or it could denitrify. And then finally, our sewage waste contains a lot of nitrogen. And in some cases, what people have is not sewage, their sewage doesn't go to a sewage system, sewage plant for conversion. It goes into a septic tank. And most septic tanks leach nitrogen into the surrounding environment. Okay, so that finishes topic 3.6. Let's now look at 3.7, abiotic factors and the distribution of species. And let's begin with the concept of geographic range. And geographic range is simply the spatial distribution of species. Where are they found on the Earth? Whether they're ground-dwelling or ground creatures living on the Earth's surface, or even flying in the atmosphere. Some species have a very large geographic range, and if they have a large geographic range, we refer to them as cosmopolitan species. While other species may only have a small geographic range, and we call these species endemic. Many species found on islands are endemic. They've evolved over time into specific species that only exist on a single island or a group of islands. So the geographic ranges of species isn't static over time. It can expand, it can contract, it can shift over the surface of the Earth, and a lot of this is related to changes in environmental factors over time. Shifts are due to colonization of species into new areas, or the removal of species by way of extinction in other areas where they once occupied. Here's an example of a cosmopolitan species. You've all seen these painted lady butterfly. They're found almost all over the world. Here's an example of a species that is highly endemic. Orange-breasted sunbird, found only in a small area of southwestern South Africa in a particular habitat. An example of a species whose geographic range has shifted over time, over the last few decades, is the mountain pine beetle. So mountain pine beetles are now killing off trees in Canada, southern Canada. Originally, they were found to the south only in the United States. Okay, another concept to talk about is ecological niche. And so we can define this as the total requirements, both physical and resource requirements, that a species needs to survive, grow, and reproduce. So this was first suggested in 1958 by ecologist G.E. Hutchinson. And he had a fancy way of describing what an ecological niche was. He suggested a niche could be modeled as an imaginary space with many dimensions. So for a plant, what would be its ecological niche? We're talking about the range of temperatures that it can tolerate. How much light does it need to successfully photosynthesize? How much humidity does it need at the ground level to grow or to have its seeds germinate? And then what is the minimum quantities of nutrients it needs for growth? So these graphs kind of visualize just two factors in an ecological niche: temperature and moisture. So graph A shows moisture on the y-axis, temperature is on the x-axis, and that red oval is the amounts required for survival. And then the graphs below are sort of cross-sections of each of those vectors. And so in B, we can see temperature, and we can see if temperature rises to a certain value, population growth begins. It in the center of that temperature x-axis, we see the maximum growth, and then it starts declining and then becomes nil. And the same thing we can see for moisture in graph C. So two useful extensions of this ecological niche are the fundamental niche and the realized niche. Fundamental niche of a species is the total range of environmental conditions that are suitable for existence without the influence of biological factors like competition or predation. Now, the realized niche is what part of that fundamental niche does the species actually occupy, and of course that relates to where it exists in terms of a geographical range. So realized niche describes the part of the fundamental niche actually occupied by species. So let's think of a species, rabbits, for example. They may only be found in a particular part of a habitat, but technically they could grow outside of that region, and that would be the fundamental niche. The realized niche would be where they actually are found. Now, why is this important? Because we've introduced a lot of species into new habitats, not knowing, well, probably knowing that they would survive there because all the conditions necessary for their growth, for their reproduction, exist. So that is part of their fundamental niche. Now, we can group species according to the type of niche they have. If their fundamental niche is quite broad and covers a large spatial area, then we can call these species generalists. If they have particular requirements in their fundamental niche, and it's very narrow, there's only a small area of the planet where these conditions occur, we call these specialists. Now, the nature of a species' fundamental niche can change because of competition and evolutionary forces. Its requirements could change because of mutations, producing new adaptations, allowing it to expand its fundamental niche in under some conditions. So this diagram gives us an example, or these photographs give us an example of a specialist. So mountain gorilla is only found in a small part of Africa, while house sparrows are generalists found almost everywhere. And they originally came from, I believe it's Europe or Asia, and we now find them. They're in North America all over the place. So here is what I meant about evolution and changing sort of pressures on fundamental niche. So here we have two species. Let's say they both arrive at an island and they overlap, as in the case of Darwin's finches. Over time, mutations would cause their requirements to diverge, so that the species don't overlap anymore and don't compete with each other over time. Okay, dispersal and colonization. Most species have the ability to move. Now, this movement can be classified into two groups. Is it passive? Do they have to use the environment to help move them? Or can they walk, swim, or fly? That would be an example of an active type of movement. So why would a species want to move? To find new habitats where resources are more plentiful, and they have higher success for survival, better growth, higher rate of reproduction, and the production of offspring. Organisms want to disperse because they want to escape the resource using effects of their parents and the siblings. So in a tree, the seedlings want to move far away from the parent tree because the parent tree is already consuming a large amount of resources. If they can find a new habitat with where those resources are not being consumed, then that's going to make their survival higher. So species are always looking for new habitats to inhabit, and we call this discovery. So here we have a coconut palm floating across the ocean, finds a new island, and germinates. So this would be an example of passive dispersal and discovery. And as we can see, there's no other plants to compete with it. So this could be a very successful colonization and what we would call establishment of that individual. A lot of annual plants use the wind to move their seedlings, so they'll produce some sort of adaptation that like here we have these hairs coming from the seed, and they're easily picked up by the wind and can travel great distances to hopefully a new site where the seedling can germinate and colonize, germinate, and establish itself. So when these organisms find new habitats, they're technically increasing the geographic range. Why is this good? Because this increases the area that they cover on the Earth, and if part of that area is disturbed, the individuals could go extinct. If you're over a larger area, there's less likely a chance that the environment will experience a disturbance. So larger range means less likely to go extinct. Now, colonization can only occur if the right conditions exist. The soil is bare, the nutrient resources are available. How do sites become bare in terms of plants? By some sort of a disturbance event. Fires, flooding can kill off species, allowing for new sites for other individuals to colonize. Once colonized, if they can grow and reproduce, we then say that they've established themselves. And establishment is usually a long-term process, and the species has to survive a whole bunch of different abiotic and biotic influences. Establishment occurs when that species when that individual is able to reproduce and send off young into the environment so they can try to colonize a new site. So one famous disturbance that occurred in 1980 was the eruption of Mount St. Helens that left a large area around the volcano devoid of life. So large amount of ash was laid down, high temperatures, killed off vegetation. There really wasn't a seed bank. And so individuals were able to come in by some sort of dispersal method and establish themselves. And one plant that was particularly successful in establishing itself was the Pacific lupin. Now, it had an advantage over other plants because it forms a symbiotic relationship with bacteria. It's and the bacteria help provide nitrogen for it. Here is an image showing probably one of the strongest disturbing effects found in ecosystems, and that's fire. Most ecosystems can burn, and burning usually destroys a large percentage of the vegetation and animals that can't escape the fire. Okay, let's talk a little bit more about abiotic factors and how they affect species distribution. So I've mentioned this before in terms of the geographic range, that most species are limited in terms of their growth and ability to reproduce by the availability of certain abiotic factors, things like temperature, moisture, and soil nutrients. No species is adapted to survive all conditions found on the earth. They generally have limits to what amounts of a particular factor they can withstand. So we call this this ability to survive only in certain levels of resource availability, its tolerance range. So all species have specific limits of tolerance to physical factors. So this graphic displays the tolerance concept. So if you the x axis here is some abiotic factor where its availability is low on the left side, high on the right side, and we see there's a zone of optimum. So it needs a certain amount of that resource in order to have optimum survival and growth. And then we have a zone of stress on either side, and then the green areas are quantities of the resource that don't allow the species to survive. One species that has a particular limit for its survival is this saguaro cactus. It can't survive freezing temperatures. So if you see it growing in a desert, that indicates that temperatures don't go below freezing in that area, because if they did, the cactus wouldn't survive, they'd be dead. So in the graphic before, we saw there was an optimum, so the optimum level of resource. So this is the level in the tolerance range where a species functions best or most efficiently. Now Liebig, a biologist from several hundred years ago, originally theorized that species usually have a single limiting factor that controls their growth. And this was based on experiments that he did with plants, and he called this the law of the minimum. So he found for most plants, the most limiting nutrient to their growth is nitrogen. However, this was sort of a simple interpretation of what organisms need in terms of resources. Most species require several different resources or factors for survival, and it's a complex interaction that may involve synergisms. So it's not a single resource that limits growth. It's usually a number of different factors that limit growth. So here, once again, we can see that area of the optimum. So we would consider, if the species only had one limiting resource, though that's the zone of quantities of that resource where it grows best and has the highest reproductive output. Okay, the last topic I want to talk about is biotic interactions, and we'll do about half of this this subtopic, and then I'll finish the rest off on Wednesday. So what is a biotic interaction? It is where biotic factors regulate the size of the population of species. And for biotic interactions to occur, you need either individuals of the same species interacting or individuals of different species interacting. So when the interactions involve the same species, we call that intraspecific effects. And so it's involving interactions of the same species. So when you look at the ponderosa pine forests around the campus, each one of those trees is interacting with the trees that are next to it, and they're competing for the same resources in the soil, for the light above them, and we would call that an interspecific interaction. Now, if you had a ponderosa pine and beside it was a Douglas fir, and they're interacting because they're different species, we call this an intraspecific interaction. Now, we can categorize biotic interactions into 4 types. And so this is a simple table describing 2 different species. So these are interspecific, not intraspecific. And we have species A fitness and species B fitness. If the effect of the 2 species interaction is negative growth and reproduction for both species, so negative, that is referred to as competition. If the interaction of the 2 species has a positive effect on growth and reproduction, so both species A and species B, the effect is positive, we call that a mutualism. In some cases, the interaction between 2 species has no effect on one species, but a positive effect on the other species. That's a commensalism. And then finally, the last type of interaction is a positive-negative. So one species that's interacting with another species has a positive increase in growth and reproduction, and the other one has a negative. So those interactions include predation, parasitism, and pathogens. So let's begin talking about competition, learn a little bit more about it. So these are 2 or more organisms in the same community seeking the same limiting resource. Maybe it's water in the soil, nitrogen in the soil, or light above coming in from the sky. If the interaction involves the same species, so as I said before, 2 ponderosa pine beside each other, that's an intraspecific competition. However, if it's a ponderosa pine and a Douglas fir beside each other, competing for resources, that would be an intraspecific competition. Now they can compete in 2 different ways. There's exploitation, and there is a type of competition, or interference, and I'll define each in just a sec. So this would be an example of exploitation, where the taller tree has greater access to the sunlight than a shorter tree, so it's better adapted, or it because of its height, it is better at consuming that resource. Or if one tree had a more extensive root system in the ground and another tree had a smaller root system, that the larger root system would have a greater ability to take up nutrients. That would be a form of exploitation, and the one with the smaller root system would suffer because it doesn't have the same ability to absorb those nutrients. Some organisms that interact with other organisms interfere with other organisms. So here we have a grouse. It can compete with members of its same species or other organisms of other species, other birds. it has a territory, and it doesn't, it aggressively keeps other individuals out of its territory so that it has greater access to those resources. Some organisms like coyotes and cougars, they mark their territory to give other individuals a heads up. Don't come here, right? This is where I do my hunting, and if you come in here, I'm going to attack you. A special form of competition that is allelopathy, and it's a type of interference, and it's something that occurs with plants. Some plants can produce toxic chemical substances that inhibit the growth of other individuals near them, and one plant that does this is black walnut. So underneath a black walnut tree, you'll see there's very few plants on the soil surface beside the trunk, and that's because black walnut produces a chemical called juglone, and juglone is toxic to other plants, killing them off. Okay, let's just look at mutualism, and we'll finish this lecture off. So mutualism is a name given to an association where pairs of species or pairs of individuals of the same species bring mutual benefit. So what does mutual benefit mean? So in the presence of these species, the species have higher growth rates, higher survival rates, higher reproductive rates when they're in the presence of the individuals than when they're not in the presence. This mutualism can be symbiotic. So symbiotic means it has to occur between these two species, and they're usually connected in some way for life, or highly adapted, so that only those, the interaction between those two types of species can produce this mutual benefit, or non-symbiotic, where the interaction can involve a variety of different species to produce the mutualism. So an example of a symbiotic mutualism is, here we have this orange lichen on a rock. So it's a specific species of algae and a specific species of fungi. They're joined together physically, and the algae provides the fungi with carbohydrates. The fungi has the ability to remove nutrients from the rock surface and give it to the algae for its growth. So if you remove the two in this environment, they won't survive. They need to the only way they can survive is to be together on this rock surface. Here is an example of a non-symbiotic mutualism. So this bee can pollinate any flower that it wants, and remove pollen, consume it, or drink the nectar. And likewise, that flower could have a mutualistic relationship with a variety of different type of pollinating insects. It's not just these two species that are required for the mutualism to occur. There's a bunch of options available. Some species have evolved over time, special physiological features and relationships. So here we have the hawk moth can only pollinate the star orchid, and it's developed this super long tongue to access the nectar and to do the pollination. And if you remove the moth, then the star orchid would not be pollinized, and it would die out. These two species depend on each other. Likewise, if you wiped out all the star orchid, the hawk moth would die out. So that's all I want to talk about in this video lecture. I'll see you in class on Wednesday, and we'll continue with biotic interactions, and we'll look at commensalism.